Greetings. My name is William Morris. I'm a patent attorney, and I am very excited and happy because I'm going to talk about something very cool, and that is how to effectively analyze office actions. And I'm going to show you a method that I've developed over the course of my practice. I've been doing this for a bit over 15 years at this point. And the method that I'm going to show you, I think, is really good for three reasons. First, it's very thorough. And of course, when you're thorough, you find your best arguments, and that always puts you in a better situation than you would be if you didn't. Second, it is structured, which means first it's repeatable, so you can build your confidence, you can build your efficiency. That's useful. Also, being structured is good because it provides you a framework within which you can make variations. So you can optimize and sort of modify to a particular situation without kind of just going off the rails. And finally, it's very well documented. And I think being well documented is, it's something that is underrated. But documentation is great because if I really write down my thought process, if I have to come back to it later, if I have to figure out what I was thinking, having it well documented is really, really helpful. And this method gives you all three of those things. So here's what we're going to do. We've got an office action. I pulled this off of Pair. So this is the method I would be using with my clients. But of course, this is not one of my client things for confidentiality reasons. But this is about the same thing as I would be doing. So we have here an office action. And what we're going to do, we start out just by getting sort of an overview of it. So I have, and this is what I do in all my cases. So I start out saying, look, what do we have here? And I'm also going to just do a little bit of reformatting just because I want to. This is not critical for the method, but I personally think it's better to do it this way. Just to have the, this is just the way I like it. So I'm going to do a tiny bit of reformatting. Which we may or may not edit out. I guess I'll find out when I see the edited version of this. Yeah, I like single spacing. I don't want any auto spacing. So there we go. All right, so I say, what do we have here? And all I'm going to do is I'm going to get an overview of the action. That'll tell me essentially what kind of rejections I'm dealing with. It'll tell me if I've got any allowable subject matter, always good to know. And it'll kind of get my subconscious working on it, so I'll get sort of a big picture, and as I drill down, I'll sort of have that big picture that I can think about as I'm going through the rest of the process. So we're going to look into this office action here, and we are going to put this on one side of my screen, and we're going to put my little document on the other side of my screen. So let's get this, and let's not minimize, but there's no particular need for that to be maximized, I don't think. So let's move this over here. All right, so what do we have here? We're going to start out. All right, so we've got some 101 rejections. So 101 rejections of claims 5, 7 through 9, 16, and 19 through 22. And we also have, again, just kind of looking through, seeing what we've got. Just looking at the structure, seeing very high level. So we also have 3 rejections of claims 1 through 5, 7 through 9, 12 through 16, 19 through 22 over due in view of Karen. All right. So we're going to just briefly kind of scroll through, look at what we've got here. So far, looks about normal. There's nothing really jumping out. And then we have responses to the arguments. There's 2 previous arguments. So this is obviously not the first office action because they're responding to the arguments we made in the last one. So the 101s, examiner asserts the term automatically does not mean without human interaction. So apparently we were made an argument about the word automatically, and the examiner says no. So automatically does not mean without human interaction. And they also said, then they said this college net, and further, simply reciting a computer can perform the steps is insufficient as it's merely applying. So merely reciting a computer is performing steps is insufficient as it is merely applying the computer. And let's spell that correctly. It's not really critical to spell everything correctly, but I mean, you know, it makes it nicer, right? You're looking at it and you don't have to worry and look at this, you don't have to look at that little red squiggle, basically, every time you look at your notes. And that, you know, it's a little bit of a, it's just a little bit of a comfort thing, right? So, and let's delete that. So we've got a little bit of a hanging indent here, just to show what we have. And we overcame the 102 rejections, so that's good. So so this has 101s and 103s, so 101. So yay, give us a little subheading, and I'm going to say this is prior art. And overcame 102 rejections. All right. So what do we have here? We know there's no there's no allowable subject matter. We've got 101s, we've got 103s. So apparently we've been making some progress on the prior art. Not super much on the 101s. So now I've got kind of my gestalt, right? My overarching view here. I know kind of what I'm looking at. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to start to just drill in to this office action. And I'm going to start with the 101s. They're the first parts. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to document what the examiner is saying. And this is a step. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to assume the examiner is right. And I just want to see what the examiner says. So we're going to go in and we're going to say, okay, the claimed invention without significantly more, and it says here's these limitations. These are covers performance in the mind, right? So these limitations cover performance in the mind. All right, so we've got sort of a mental steps rejection here, mental process, and then the examiner goes through and they say it's not integrated into a practical application. In particular, only generic computing devices. So no practical application. Only generic computing devices. And, you know, we're going to go through and we're going to kind of just really document what the examiner says and what the examiner's justifications are. And we're not going to check that. So, for example, we go in here and we see, okay, look, the examiner cites this MPEP 210605F. During this phase, we aren't going to check what the examiner says. We're just going to document it. And this does two things. One, it gives us that thoroughness I was saying, right? So you make sure you go through, because what if the examiner skipped a step, right? What if they didn't do everything they're supposed to do? Going through and literally documenting this and saying, what exactly do they do? You'll find that. You'll see that. Also, again, it kind of primes your mind. So you can be thinking about this going forward for sort of the final step, which is figuring out what your arguments are going to be and how you're going to respond. So I'm not going to go through the whole thing, but I think you kind of see, and I think you can see from what I've done so far, essentially what I'm doing in this step for the 101s. And I'm going to show you what I do with the 103s because it's slightly different. So with 101, what you have is this framework, right? So the framework is it directed to an abstract idea? And they say yes, covers performance in the mind, and because it's not a practical application. And then they also talk about generic computing devices and is not significantly more. And so what I'll do is I'll say here are how they work within that framework. So I've started up here with the abstract idea directed to framework, and then I would continue on with the rest of the framework, why the examiner say it's not significantly more. I'll probably talk about the dependent claims a little. The 103s are a little different. So this is really getting into the claim language itself, not an analytic framework. And let me show you how I'm going to do that. So if this were my claim, if this were my case, I would have a copy of the claims from the last rejection, but it's not my case. However, in order to prepare this, I've made a copy of the claims, so we are going to paste those into here. And what's going to happen is I'm going to essentially say, how are these mapped to the prior art, right? So this is claim 1, and we're going to put another heading here. How are the claims mapped to the art? And these headings, I think, are actually kind of important. And here's why the headings are important. Because when I come back, if I come back, and let's be realistic, I'm probably going to put this down and come back to it later. Maybe it'll be in the next office action. If I get another rejection, I'll want to see what I was thinking. I'll be asking the same questions then that I'm asking right now during my first analysis. And if I have those questions as bold headings, it will be very easy for me to look in and say, ah, there it is, because the bolding sort of catches my eye, right? I see it. It's very simple. It's very easy to kind of pick back up where I was. I'm also going to change this formatting again just a little bit. This isn't necessary, but for me, I think it's good to again use just the single spacing for it because it makes it more compact. Obviously, for the response itself, it has to be 1.5 spacing, but for here, I just want the information to be there. I don't really need it to be sort of spaced out and quite as easy to read as I would be if I was actually putting it into the response itself. So what I'm going to do then is, in order to make this 103, or in order to deal with the 103 rejections, we're going to go down and we're literally going to go limitation by limitation and see what they've said. And already there's actually something interesting here. And that is, so it says in regards to claims 1, 12, and 19, and the examiner is actually talking about claim 12, not about claim 1. Now you're allowed to group claims together. That's not per se a bad thing. But the fact that it's claim 12, sometimes examiners, in my experience, they'll group things together that really aren't exactly the same. And by going limitation by limitation, if there's some salient difference between claim 12 and claim 1, by going limitation to limitation, I'm going to see that. It's going to be very, very clear to me. So what I'm going to do is it says, all right, we've got do, discloses an automation-assisted elevation certificate production method, and that is what we have here also, right? An automation-assisted elevation certificate production method. Okay, so now we're going to actually get into it. So in claim 1, we have it's a method, and it starts receiving by this elevation certificate application hosted on a server address information associated with real property. So how does that map with what the examiner has done with claim 12? And the answer is, here we go. So, and now I'm going to take this, and I'm going to put a little comment. So let's go with a new comment. This is now, I'm going to see what it is. Do paragraphs 31, 47, 64, 65. Citation to MPEP 2111.05. All right. And I'm going to go through and I'm going to do that with all of the limitations in claim 1. And in fact, I'm probably going to do that with the dependent claims too, right? Because you can have something, and I've had this in my experience, where examiners will simply leave off a limitation or they'll leave off a claim. And by going through this in this systematic manner, you find that, you see it. Now we don't have to go through all of that here. It's clearly, it is somewhat time consuming. Happily, for the purposes of this demonstration, I have already prepared what that's going to just look like for claim 1. So we're going to switch to this other document here. You can see this sort of has my more full discussion of the 101s, right? So it goes through, says we receive elevation data, therefore it's an abstract, we recite it, no practical application, significantly more, talks about some dependent claims. But here's what it looks like once I have mapped out this claim to the limitation. So we've got, here's the claim, and each of these limitations, right, you can see as I scroll down, the limitations are kind of highlighted as I select each comment. And here's something interesting. A nice thing about this is when you go through limitation by limitation, if there's something where it's not 100%, even by the examiner, right? So I haven't even gotten into the examiner, are they right or wrong? I'm just saying, what did they say? But look in here. Look in here. There's a gap, right? We've got this guy here. The examiner says this is here. And the examiner has this little automatically there. and then we've got this and that. But this part here, where we're actually generating this linear approximation of a local slope in the area, by doing the we're doing the so let me restate that. So right in here, where we have this identifying one or more outlier elevation data points, automatically generating the linear approximation in the area between the structure boundary and buffer boundary based on this data, and then automatically identifying outlier elevation points. This is something the examiner doesn't really say a whole lot about, right? They have this automatically. They say it means without human, it doesn't necessarily mean without human interaction, same thing as we saw in the 101 response to arguments. But, this tells me this is an area where it looks less powerful, right? Even with the examiner saying, they're kind of leaving things a little bit more open. So now I've got an idea of kind of where I'm going to look, where to focus, kind of just initially, right? And so now the question is, okay, let's start checking what the examiner says. And again, we don't have to go through the whole thing, but what I'll do is I will say, all right, what is these prior art references? So we'll scroll up here, and I say, what is do? That's the primary reference that they've cited. I gave here just a very brief statement about do, but what I'm going to do, and if I would be, writing this up, what I would go through is I would say, all right, in every one of these paragraphs, I'll go through, and if I think it's, really, yeah, this is not worth arguing about, this is not something that, really makes a lot of sense to fight on, I'll say, all right, cool. So here we're going to say, and I'll scroll. So this will say do for paragraph 31 says, right? What does it actually say? So at this point, what I would do is I would go through and I would look at that. And I would say, here's what paragraph 47 says. Paragraph 64 says. We're going to delete this. Paragraph 65 says. So I'm going to, again, documentation I think is key, and being systematic and being thorough is key. So I'm going to say, what do these things really say, right? So we started out trusting the examiner. Now it's trust but verify. So I'm now going to verify this stuff. And what will happen out of this is I will come up with parts of this office action that are not necessarily great, right? These are kind of weak points. I will also not just verify the prior art, but I'm going to verify the statements that the examiner makes, right? These legal kinds of concepts. So, for example, let's find something here. All right. Well, you know what? Let's just do this. We'll do the mind thing, right? So what I'll do. No, let's not do. So, and in any case, what I will do is I won't just verify I won't only verify the prior art. I'll also go through, like in this case, they have design choice. They do CollegeNet versus apply yourself. They cite a case. They cited the MPEP insert in various parts. So what I'm going to do is I'm literally going to go to like the MPEP, and I'm going to look at it and I'm going to say, does it really say what they think what the examiner is saying it says? So this one, MPEP 2106-05F. And here I am, MPEP 2106-05F, coincidentally. And whether it's, okay, abstract idea, exception on a computer. So, okay, so the examiner did not misrepresent this part of it. Again, are they right or wrong relative to our case? That's a different question, but we're now verifying what the examiner said. And so after the verification step, then we get to the final point, and we've laid ourselves a foundation. And the final part is we make our arguments. What are we going to say, right? Because we're not just doing this to analyze it. We're doing this in order to make a response to a rejection. And so I think this is going to run into a little limitation here. So on these videos, right, I don't provide legal advice. I don't provide legal opinions. And I think me actually going into the arguments might might cross that line. So I'm going to tell you a few sort of guidelines on this, a few sort of tips, but I'm not going to actually do this last step. I'm not going to write up any arguments because I think that might cross the line, and I'm not going to do that. This isn't going to go into legal advice. But here's what I'll say on a couple of things. Thing number one, so when you've gone through this, the foundation that I was mentioning, by verifying, by going through everything, you will know where you think the examiner is wrong, and you'll know why the examiner you think is wrong. Or you'll think the examiner is right, but you'll have ideas, here are ways that we can nail that down. It'll make it very easy to kind of focus on that. And I think you should. And I also think it makes sense. So I will look at my language. So let's say I think the examiner is totally wrong about this, right? They say this is in there, and I say it's totally not. What I'll do is I'll say, okay, is there any way I can amend this to foreclose the examiner's interpretation? Or is the examiner's, and I will also say, is the examiner's interpretation in any way reasonable? And if the answer is yes and yes, I might actually propose that amendment, right? So I'll think about it. I'll try and say, look, let's assume I'm wrong. Let's assume I made a mistake here, but I think the examiner's wrong about their ultimate conclusion. How do I get them there? And the one thing I'll think about is, do I need to make an amendment here, and what possible amendments can I make to foreclose them? And that's one way I'll work with things, and I think that's very useful. Another thing that's very useful is to kind of see what's worked previously on these. So for instance, with this like limitations in the mind, right? One thing that I have in my practice, which I think is a good idea to do, is I have literally a Word document that says, here are examples of office action responses that deal with these kinds of arguments. Things that I've written myself and that I find good, and so I can use those as kind of a library. I've also put together some software here, which I will pull up. And what this software is going to do is it's very similar to my my Word document, except instead of being my examples, my knowledge, this goes beyond my knowledge. This is going to match the office action against basically a giant database of material that you pull off of PAIR, and it will say, here are things that other people have said in similar situations that you could potentially use in your responding to this office action. So this, again, when you're developing arguments, I think looking at what's happened in the past, what people have said in the past, whether it's you, whether it's somebody else, I think is very valuable. So again, what I'm going to do here, and I'm not saying this is good or bad, right? I'm not doing any legal advice on this. But let's say we're looking at this, and this one was starting with the first kind of an argument. It was about mind, right? They said it couldn't be done. It was something that, happening in the mind. So we'll look at this and we'll say we want responses to office actions where they said something was in the mind, has to be a 101. And we want the response itself to talk about that. So it has to use the word mind too. So we're going to apply selections. And what we've got here is we've got responses. So we will, let's see here, virtual receptionist. This looks promising, right? So I'll look at it. And again, we're not saying this is good. We're not saying that the person here should or shouldn't do use any of these arguments. But I think this is a useful thing when you're generating your own arguments to kind of look at what already exists and see how people have dealt with stuff. So for example, in this case, they're talking about, it does not fall within the third grouping, mental processes, because this 2019 guidance states this grouping includes concepts performed in the mind, and these claims require steps that can't be performed in the mind. So here's an example of an argument that people have made that in this case apparently was successful. So, this response here overcame some 101s. Maybe I want to use this argument. Again, we're not going to go into that on this case, but in general, when you're looking at arguments, when you're trying to figure out your own strategy, once you've built that foundation, or even once you're building it, right? So you can look at it and say, you know what? I'm not 100% sure where to go on here. Let me look. How do people deal with these 101s? Maybe I'm not as familiar with 101. I don't know the framework. I can look and see what people have done. and I can help build that out. I can help identify arguments, and I can help analyze and come to my own strategy effectively with this method, which again, I think it's very thorough, it's very systematic, and it generates great documentation. So after I've done this, and I'll write this down, right? I will do this, and I will write down what I'm doing. I'll write down what I found. I'll say, here's a response, here's my arguments. And so if I have to put this down, come back to it in a week because something else has come up, I can easily do that. If I have to put this down because I filed my response and I have to come back to it 3 months later to say, hey, why was I doing that? I'll have everything here and I will be able to jump back on it very, very quickly. So I think it's a really effective approach. I think it's a good way to analyze office actions, and it sets you up very well for a successful response and a successful prosecution. So there it is. I hope you find this useful. I hope you have great success in your own practice, and I wish you good luck and good patents. Thank you very much.